please.
So it's my experience that this word contagion is a big sticking point for a lot of people. So it's brilliant that it's there in the title, and I really want to spend some time persuading you that contagion is the right word. I did ask James what he was going to say, so I knew that he had given a lot of the overview and the figures, so I'm not going to do that. I want to start by telling you about how anorexia came to Hong Kong. Anorexia, as we know it, the idea that a person can look at themselves and see themselves as fat when they're nearly dead of starvation, that's a specific type of self-starvation. It's not something that's universal. It's not something that always happened. There have been people who have self-starved that have popped up. The idea has occurred to them spontaneously throughout history. And it's generally been because they regard their life as simply not worth living. They don't say, I'm fat. They say, I can't eat. I have a lump in my throat. I don't want to eat. They turn their face to the wall, basically. But this particular syndrome of thinking that you're fat and starving yourself is something that grew up in America. It's a 1970s America idea, and the same of bulimia. And it was not known in Hong Kong until a teenage girl who hated herself, hated her life, had nothing good in it, had no friends, had no interests, starved herself to death, and she died on the street in, I think, 1993. It was mid-1990s. And it was the start of the internet. And so the journalists who were covering this unheard-of event looked up what happens when teenage girls starved, and they found American stories. And they presented to the people of Hong Kong the notion that a teenage girl who hates herself and experiences going through puberty as a miserable experience, that she can starve herself, but she will think herself fat. And in about a year, Hong Kong went from seeing this happen maybe once or twice a year to seeing dozens of cases a week. That is a social contagion, and it's not spread from one person to another. I think people feel that I might be saying that a trans child is contagious and might have to be segregated from other children or something like that. It's not that. It's not a person-to-person contagion. It's as if it's in the water or the air. It's in what we breathe. These are called culture-bound syndromes, and there are many culture-bound syndromes, but they're hard to see in your own culture. Anything where we feel dis-ease or unwellness in ourselves that isn't just a straightforward, I've got a cold. The way that it is somatized, the way that it is experienced in our bodies is something that historically has been negotiated between patients and doctors. You go to the doctor and you say, I feel something, and in the conversation with the doctor, they shape how you feel it. So there was hysteria, there's anorexia, there's bulimia, and this is called the symptom pool. That's a term from a medical historian called Edward Shorter. And so Edward Shorter wrote this book called From Paralysis to Fatigue in 1993, and in it he looked back through the history of culture-bound syndromes like hysteria, and he said rather presciently, I think that the shaping of the symptom pool is moving from being to do with doctors to being to do with the media. And he was looking at the way that the media spread ideas about how we get sick, how we feel when we are sick. Well, it's social media now. And my contention is that gender distress and subsequent trans identification, as it is experienced now, is a culture-bound syndrome. So it's one that arose in America, and I go into more detail in my book about how that happened. But very briefly, for the purposes of this event, basically it's sort of several streams coming together, one of them being doctors who over decades had basically created this diagnosis of transsexuality for extremely rare people, maybe 1 in 100,000 sort of people, who spontaneously felt that they weren't meant to be members of their sex. And then another strand, which was sort of post-1960s French postmodernism, and the way that that developed on American campuses into queer theory and gender studies. And queer theory is an approach to categories that sees all categories as inherently oppressive and seeks to blur boundaries and regards transgression as a good thing in itself. And these things sort of came along together. Then along came social media, and to an extent that anyone older than about 30 is basically blind to, on sites like Tumblr and TikTok, these things metastasized, and only children were there. If you think of the novel Lord of the Rings, sorry, not Lord of the Rings, my God, Lord of the Flies, big difference there. If you think of Lord of the Flies, you see what children are like when they're socializing each other with no adults in the room. That's what Tumblr was like, 2012, 2016. I see some girls looking at me. In about 2012, Tumblr said that you couldn't have self-harm on the site anymore, and that basically got rid of a lot of the content, and it switched to gender. And now it's TikTok. And so what you see on these sites, because there are no adults, you see children and children's creativity, and things move fast, they morph. And children are inexperienced, they're febrile, trends go through them with extraordinary speed, and they mutate all the while. And in the case of gender, it's got to some very strange places indeed. So people sometimes ask why this trend overtakes specifically teenage girls, and it's because they were on Tumblr. At least I think that's a part of it. So there's an important difference between self-starvation and having gender distress, and that is that most of us don't actually want to starve. We don't want to die. We may think that we're fat, but we have no control over our appetites or whatever. But basically, very large numbers of people do feel things about their gender, whatever their gender is. Gender nonconformity is a very common experience, and I'm going to tell you some groups that are quite gender nonconforming. One group is people who are gay or who are going to grow up to be gay. There's a strong link between being a very gender nonconforming young child and growing up to be gay. And of course, having sex with someone of your own sex is a very gender nonconforming thing to do in itself. Another group is people who are on the autistic spectrum, whether they know it or not. There's all sorts of odd feelings that people who are on the spectrum can have about their bodies, feelings of dis-ease, feelings that categories aren't clear. They're people who need a lot of clarity, so if they're a bit unusual, they can think they should be fitted into the other group. Erotic cross-dressers. About 3% of men get a thrill out of dressing as women, a sexual thrill. Very gender non-conforming thing to do. That can become all-consuming. And you know what, most women? Gender can be a bit of a prison, and especially for girls nowadays who can look and see what they're meant to be like, very pornified, long nails, high heels, spray tan, long hair, all that sort of stuff. If you don't think that's you, well then you're gender non-conforming these days. And so my contention is that what's happening now is an encouragement of rumination about gender, an environment that makes it likely that your gender is experienced in a painful and uneasy way, a shaping of all sorts of distress into gender-related distress, and finally, a historically unprecedented interpretation of these gender-related thoughts and distress as meaning something, which is that the person is not actually of their sex. That's a new idea. People did not think until the last 10 or 20 years, at the very, very longest, that somebody who felt they were a member of the opposite sex actually were a member of the opposite sex. So we're creating an enormous amount of distress. James told us how that's happening. It's happening in schools, it's happening online, it's happening in science lessons, in RSE, schools transitioning kids behind their parents' back, encouraging children to question their identities. So it's not just a social contagion, it's a social contagion on a scale the world has never seen before.
Thank you very much.